I was scrolling through my feed the other day, and I saw two posts, back to back. The first was from an old high school friend, sharing a link for Breitbart News. The caption was something like, "The only place you'll see the real story." 2 seconds later, a post from a former colleague linking to HuffPost. "This is the only thing you need to read today." It was jarring. This feeling that everyone is convinced they're in the one true echo chamber and everyone else is brainwashed. It feels like we're all living in these completely separate, high-walled information castles. You've got the Fox News castle over here and the MSNBC castle over there, and it feels like they're just launching insults back and forth with no way to even send a message between them. It makes you wonder if it's even possible to have a shared conversation anymore. What was really interesting and what got me thinking was, what if that feeling, that sense of total, complete separation, isn't actually the full story? What if the data shows something different? What if, hidden in that network, there are actually pathways or bridges connecting these two worlds? And if so, who's building them?
That is the perfect encapsulation of the challenge we face right now. I mean, that sense of isolation is just, it's pervasive. But the good news, as you hinted, is that researchers and media organizations are actively investigating this exact phenomenon. They're looking for those pathways, those strategic information bridges. They're moving beyond simply diagnosing the problem to trying to, engineer solutions.
And that's our mission for this deep dive. We went into a stack of studies focusing on political communication, on conflict mediation techniques, and even experimental design within digital platforms. We're looking for tangible data, for expert strategies that reveal how we build these bridges between these deeply divided information worlds.
Right.
Specifically, we want to know the strategic implications for, say, U.S. media organizations and policymakers. I mean, how do they leverage these identified bridge news outlets or even specific conversational tactics to maybe mitigate some of this polarization in our fractured digital information ecosystem?
Exactly. We need to investigate who builds these bridges, whether it's, a big media organization or just a single person changing the way they talk. And then what's the measurable impact these efforts actually have on polarization?
Yeah, what does it actually do?
Are we talking about small, incremental attitudinal shifts, or can these interventions lead to, measurable systemic change? To understand the practical limits and the possibilities of these bridges, though, we first have to fully appreciate the height and thickness of those walls we're trying to cross.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We're not talking about simple party affiliation anymore, are we? The research has undergone what some political scientists are calling an identity turn. It's shifted our understanding of how politics, how it functions in the brain. It's moved from just Democrat or Republican to something much more complex, identity alignment.
And that's where political scientist Liliana Mason's work on partisan social sorting becomes so crucial. She argues that what we're experiencing is a psychological merging of multiple identities. Historically, your political identity might have been one component of your overall self-perception, but now your political identity and your social identities, your identity as a Republican or as someone who lives in a rural area or as a Christian, they've all fused together. They're just not compartmentalized anymore.
So if I identify strongly as a Democrat, I'm now also much more likely to identify strongly with the specific set of aligned social attributes, like being secular or urban or highly educated. It's not just a political alignment, it's a whole social and cultural identity package.
Precisely. And this creates what they term a unified, highly committed mega-identity. Think of it like this. In the mid-20th century, you could easily be a deeply religious, pro-labor union Republican living in a city. Those were cross-cutting identities, and they acted like psychological shock absorbers.
Right, so if the Republican Party did something you disagreed with,
your labor identity might kick in and temper your reaction. Exactly. You had multiple reference groups pulling you in different directions, which tends to calm partisan impulses.
But now, with the mega-identity, those cross-cutting ties have been dramatically reduced.
Completely. The power of the mega-identity is that everything is now aligned. When one part of that identity, say your political affiliation, is challenged, the whole system feels threatened. Your community, your values, even your sense of self-worth. The psychological commitment inside that identity tent becomes enormous, making the reaction to any external critique either extreme loyalty or extreme hostility.
Which is why political debates often feel like these existential battles over fundamental values, not just, policy disagreements.
It explains why the temperature is so high. It turns out the stakes really are existential, at least in a psychological sense, for the highly sorted.
And what's particularly telling, based on the longitudinal data, and this spans nearly 50 years, from 1972 to 2020, is who is actually driving this extreme sorting. We often talk about polarization as this generalized national problem, but the data tells a more specific story.
It really does. The increase in ideological sorting, that widening gap between the parties, it occurred almost exclusively among the segment of the population most interested and attentive to politics.
Wait. So the sorting didn't happen across the board. The average American isn't necessarily more sorted than they were in the 70s.
Not at all. The data shows people who are classified as not much interested or maybe somewhat interested in politics are no more ideologically sorted today than they were 50 years ago. They simply aren't engaged enough in the political environment to internalize all the cues that create that mega-identity.
The extreme polarization we worry about is primarily driven by the highly engaged minority.
Which is the same group most likely to be consuming political media multiple times a day.
That has huge policy implications. I mean, does this mean platforms and media organizations looking to depolarize should focus their limited resources on intervening with that small, highly engaged minority, or should they focus on the large, unengaged middle?
That's the critical strategic question, isn't it? If the highly engaged are driving the toxicity, you have to intervene there. But intervening there is so difficult, precisely because their identities are so solidified. The next finding, though, suggests a concrete strategy because it shows that the frequency of news consumption isn't the clear predictor of social sorting.
Oh, that's interesting.
Instead, the composition of the media diet matters profoundly.
Okay, let's dig into that distinction, because it counters the simple narrative that more news equals more polarization. How did the research illustrate that composition is the key?
Well, the researchers analyzed specific media diets, so the combination of news outlets an individual routinely consumes, and then they correlated those diets with their social sorting scores. What they found was a really clear pattern regarding where sorting was lowest.
I'm going to guess the lowest was the group that just ignores news entirely.
That's the first group, individuals with minimal news diets. You're right, they're disconnected and therefore less sorted. But the second group is the key to building bridges. Sorting is also low among people whose diets contain a higher probability of including cross-cutting or centrist sources.
So it's not just exposure to news. It's exposure to diverse news that acts as a kind of psychological counterweight. The diversity tempers the identity alignment process, even if they are also consuming partisan sources.
Exactly. And the opposite is true for the most sorted Americans. The highest levels of sorting are found among respondents whose media diets contain outlets aligned with their identity, and this is the important part, contain few other unaligned or centrist outlets. This is the classic right-only media diet, for example. A high probability of FOX and conservative radio, but a very low probability of anything else. The sources are exclusively reinforcing that mega-identity.
So the strategic intervention isn't necessarily stopping people from consuming partisan news, which is probably impossible.
Likely impossible, yes.
But successfully nudging them to add diversity to their routine. The goal is to strategically boost the consumption of centrist content.
The left and centrist media diet is the perfect proof point for this. These respondents consumed left partisan sources like HuffPost and CNN, but crucially, their diets also contained multiple centrist high-quality sources, things like the BBC, USA Today, and the Wall Street Journal. And this resulted in significantly lower sorting scores compared to diets that were purely left-leaning without those centrist outlets.
That's a phenomenal insight for media strategy.
Yeah.
It suggests that these centrist outlets aren't just a separate niche. They're functioning as essential tempering agents for the highly engaged partisan consumer. So the goal for policymakers then becomes clear. How do we strategically boost the audience and influence of these centrist bridge outlets?
That's right. Centrist outlets, or outlets designed for cross-cutting consumption, are not just surviving. They are structurally necessary to prevent the mega-identity from hardening even further. But shifting consumption patterns is only one part of the solution. Once we have people exposed to different perspectives, we also have to look at how journalists and really anyone covers these issues, because the traditional approaches to conflict coverage, they often backfire dramatically.
Okay, let's move on to the actual conversation.
Yeah.
So if polarization is driven by the brain entering this state of intractable conflict, where we feel threatened by the other side and are immediately resistant to new information, then simply throwing both sides at the listener often just escalates the conflict.
Right, and what's fascinating here is how much journalists can learn from conflict mediators and social psychologists who deal with these high-stakes, difficult conversations every single day. Mediators see the default journalistic approach, soliciting opposing positions and then just letting the conflict sit there, as missing a huge opportunity. They argue that the role of a journalist, when covering conflict, is to act as a catalyst for understanding complexity.
Let's use the concrete examples from the sources of how traditional media coverage failed. We have the critiques of those much-publicized segments, like the one Oprah Winfrey hosted for 60 Minutes, bringing together divided citizens in Michigan after the 2016 election.
Yeah, the mediator critique of that 60-minute segment was that it was dull and superficial because it focused entirely on collecting opposing positions. One participant, a man, said he loved Trump more every day, and the woman next to him said Trump made her feel sick to her stomach. Oprah never asked questions that revealed their deeper motivations or their fears or the complexity within their own views. She simply affirmed the deadlock. She was summarizing conflict, not excavating pathways out of it.
It sounds like they were operating in a vacuum, almost assuming that just presenting two extreme views constitutes objective reporting, when in reality it just confirms the audience's existing biases about the other side.
Exactly. It simplifies the human beings involved. And another powerful example is Van Jones, who tried to build bridges by interviewing a family of Trump supporters. When one woman shared this emotional, really painful story about losing a longtime friend over politics and being labeled as two-faced, Jones completely failed to employ a critical mediation technique called looping for understanding.
So instead of engaging with her pain, he just pivoted back to the politics.
He did. I mean, he recognized her genuine suffering, but instead of validating that personal, emotional cost, which is the prerequisite for trust, he immediately launched into this short lecture about how liberals and conservatives view liberty differently. He used her vulnerability as a launching pad for an analytical retort that violates a fundamental psychological principle necessary for de-escalation.
Which is, you must be heard before you will listen. If you bypass that emotional acknowledgement, the person just remains on the defensive and no amount of accurate factual or analytical information will get through.
It's the foundational step. So what are the practical strategies that journalists, or really anyone trying to engage across a divide, should adopt? The sources identify 4 key strategies based on mediation techniques for disrupting this intractable conflict. Let's start with strategy 1, amplify contradictions.
This sounds counterintuitive. Are we talking about catching people in hypocrisy?
Not at all. It's about intentionally finding and featuring the details that don't fit the neat, tidy narrative of the mega-identity. Go back to that 60-minute segment. When the participant, Tom, said he loved Trump more every day, he immediately added a qualification. He said, I still don't like his attacks, his Twitter attacks. I don't think that's appropriate.
That is a perfect internal contradiction. He holds 2 conflicting views at the same time.
A mediator would have seized that moment as pure gold. Instead of turning to the next person for the opposing position, they would have said, gosh, Tom, that's so interesting. Tell me more about that tension. You feel this deep loyalty, but you also think his behavior is inappropriate. How do you resolve those 2 feelings in your mind?
By drawing out the nuance with the single person's view, you set a new tone for the entire conversation. You're forcing complexity to the surface.
Precisely. And complexity, it turns out, is the antidote to polarization because it destabilizes the simple, rigid narrative that the mega-identity relies on. If the audience sees a partisan interviewee grappling with nuance, it gives them permission to grapple with nuance too. It models constructive uncertainty.
Okay, strategy 2 is about widening the lens, shifting from episodic to thematic framing. This seems to be more of an editorial decision than just a conversational one.
Oh, it is. It's a profound structural decision about how newsrooms allocate their resources. Episodic framing is narrow, focusing on a single event or individual problem, one specific act of gun violence, one family struggle with healthcare costs. Thematic framing is much wider, focusing on systemic issues, causes, and broader trends, the national history of gun manufacturing legislation, or the systematic failures of rural healthcare infrastructure.
And the psychological impact of that shift is massive, based on the research.
Absolutely. Research shows that if you watch a story framed episodically about one person struggling with poverty, you are more likely to blame the individual for their circumstances, poor choices, lack of work ethic. But if you watch the same issue framed thematically, focusing on systemic causes of poverty wage stagnation, lack of affordable housing, you are more likely to attribute blame to government and society. This dramatically changes the nature of the policy debate.
So we inadvertently let political systems off the hook by focusing too narrowly on the drama of individual cases. How do bridge builders use this shift in a high-conflict scenario?
The anecdote about the Gloucester public sculpture feud is a masterclass in this technique. The town was paralyzed by this intense local partisan division over whether people liked a proposed 25-foot steel sculpture near the waterfront. People were furious, insults were flying on social media, the town council was deadlocked. The organizers realized they couldn't solve the problem by debating the merits of the sculpture itself. The argument was too personal and too simplified.
So they changed the question entirely.
They shifted the feud into a broader thematic inquiry. What do we want from our public art, and how should these decisions be made? They invited local leaders, held large public meetings asking wide-open questions about public space, and residents covered a huge map with sticky notes marking buildings that needed renovation, old statues that had been forgotten, and locations for new works. By reframing the conflict from yes-no on the sculpture to the systemic question of how do we decide on public space, they created an inquiry that was bigger than the deadlock.
And it moved the argument out of the narrow personal attack zone and into a productive, shared civic project.
It relieves the tension because people want to be part of a bigger solution, not just a smaller fight.
Which brings us to strategy 3. Change the kinds of questions we ask, move from observable positions to the underlying motivations.
Yes, we have to move past the superficial positions like Obamacare is bad or gun control is essential, and relentlessly dig for the deeper interests or values driving those positions. For a staunch gun rights advocate, the position might be against regulation, but the deeper value might be a profound belief in self-sufficiency, or a skepticism towards centralized government authority, or the importance of protecting one's community in the face of perceived disorder.
And crucially, these deeper values are almost always human self-sufficiency, community safety, which are inherently more interesting and relatable than a bumper sticker slogan.
They are the golden tickets to finding common humanity. One mediator who used to be a journalist realized that traditional journalism was failing because it relied on the stock political script. She suggested journalists adopt these non-standard, introspective questions. How did you come to have your political views? Or what is oversimplified about this issue? Or perhaps even, what's the question nobody is asking about this?
The moment you have to explain how you came to believe something, you realize your position didn't arrive scientifically. It was shaped by your family history, your geography, a pivotal experience.
Exactly, or an encounter with a bureaucratic system. These questions force the person out of their habitual political script and require them to articulate their own backstory, which is necessarily more complex than their political identity. That moment of introspection is an essential component of depolarization.
And finally, strategy 4, which we touched on with the Van Jones critique, listen more and better, specifically through looping for understanding.
This simple technique is magical because it demonstrates immediate, sincere empathy and focus. Looping means distilling what you heard, the other person's most important message, often laced with emotion, and checking for accuracy before you respond with your own point.
Can you give us an example of how that would sound in a political context, maybe in the heat of an argument?
Sure. Let's say someone is railing against environmental regulations because they feel it's destroying their local economy. Instead of arguing the science, a loop might sound like this. So what I hear you saying is that you feel deeply betrayed by the government because those regulations have created uncertainty, and you worry about your children having to leave the community to find work. Did I get that right?
That is highly specific and focuses on their values, family, community stability, not their position that regulations are bad.
Exactly. And the person might say, yes, that's right, or, as often happens, no, it's not just my children, it's that the rules feel arbitrary and unfair. That tiny correction shows you missed a nuance, but the act of having been looped correctly, of having your core message articulated by the other side, creates a sense of cognitive ease. It confirms, I have been heard, and this person actually listened, not just waited to talk.
And once you feel heard, you relax your guard. That's the prerequisite for listening. You open up the cognitive space for challenging information. These psychological bridges, built one conversation at a time, are essential. But that psychological work needs to be supported by institutional commitment, which brings us to the strategic bridge builders, media organizations themselves, and how they overcome competition to collaborate. So we've established that media diets matter, and how we talk matters. Now let's look at the organizations attempting to scale this impact by working together, what's often called collaborative journalism. They are attempting to build structural bridges between diverse audiences and centers of power.
Right. Collaborative journalism is formally defined as an arrangement, either formal or informal, between two or more news organizations to supplement resources and, critically, to maximize the impact of the content produced. The core idea is that if a story is published in one newspaper, it might reach a local audience. But if it's published simultaneously in 50 outlets across the political spectrum, it's much harder for policymakers to ignore.
And it's more likely to reach the diverse audiences needed to temper polarization.
Exactly.
The key word there is impact. How is that impact measured? Because views or clicks don't really capture systemic long-term change, which is the stated goal of these ambitious collaborations, right?
They do not. Not at all. To accurately assess the value of this kind of reporting, impact architects developed a sophisticated media impact framework that breaks change into 4 distinct categories, moving far beyond simple engagement metrics.
Okay, tell us about those 4 types of journalistic impact, because this is essential for understanding the strategic value of collaboration.
The first is individual impact. This is a change at the level of the audience member, so increased knowledge, a shift in attitude, or an intent to take action. This is where simple engagement metrics, page views, time on page, are used as proxies, but true individual impact requires rigorous pre- and post surveys. The second is institutional impact. This is often considered the gold standard because it's tangible and measurable. Legislative policy changes, regulatory shifts, corporate policy reversals, or even personnel changes resulting directly from the reporting. This means the content influenced official behavior.
Right. And the third?
Third, we have network impact. This is the most enduring type of impact, and it often leads to lasting social change. It involves new networks of citizens, NGOs, or activist groups forming around the content, or established networks using the content in their own work. This leads to sustained organizing, coalition building, or even social movements.
And the last one?
And finally, media amplification. This is about raw reach and agenda setting, so greater reach through mentions, citations, or republishing by non-partner media. Collaborative journalism is explicitly designed to maximize its amplification across a fragmented media landscape.
The sources provide a phenomenal case study that defines the gold standard for institutional impact. The International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, or ICIJ, famous for the Panama Papers.
ICIJ is the ultimate example of a high-impact global investigation using a temporary, co-created structure, hundreds of journalists working together secretly across dozens of countries. Their primary mission is to spur external, institutional, and individual impact, and they are incredibly rigorous about their measurement methodology. They ask 3 preliminary questions before starting a project. Which countries are involved? Are there large, verifiable data sets? And, critically, can the story have significant institutional impact? If the answer to that third question is no, they usually pivot.
And the Panama Papers exposed these expensive offshore financial and tax evasion schemes, forcing governments worldwide to act. How exactly did they track that massive financial recovery number? It seems difficult to isolate the impact of the journalism from, broader economic trends.
It requires a specific methodology based on public data. ICIJ only counts recoveries when a government agency or a tax authority explicitly attributes a specific fine or seizure or tax payment to evidence uncovered directly in the papers or the reporting that followed. They track the resulting institutional impact very closely. 3 years after the Panama Papers broke, ICIJ was able to devise a methodology to calculate how much money governments had recovered.
And the conservative estimate was just stunning.
Conservatively, they counted $1.2 billion recovered by governments globally, solely tied to the investigation. They also documented at least 82 government investigations into tax avoidance, resignations of high-level officials, and the creation of new anti-money laundering legislation in multiple countries. This provides a direct, verifiable line from journalism to institutional change, proving that collaborative scale leads to measurable policy impact.
That's the institutional gold standard. But what about organizations focused on changing the practice of journalism itself? That's where the Solutions Journalism Network, or SJN, comes in.
SJN is fascinating because they focus on rigorous reporting about responses to problems, not just the problems themselves. Their goal is systemic change, not just through external policy, but through internal change in newsroom culture. They serve as project coordinator for ongoing collaboratives like the Re-Entry Project in Philadelphia, which focuses on systemic issues facing formerly incarcerated people.
So they are building 2 sets of bridges, external bridges to audiences and internal bridges between competing newsrooms by normalizing this solutions-oriented reporting.
Exactly. And SJN rigorously measures internal impact, which is unique. They use standardized pre- and post-project surveys with participating journalists, They want to know, did the journalists' perceptions of collaboration shift? Are they now more likely to pursue solutions-oriented reporting? This is essential because their mission is to shift newsroom practice, so changing the capacity and culture of the journalists involved is a key measured impact.
Then we have INN's Amplify News project, Seeking a Cure, which focused explicitly on maximizing reach and policy influence regarding rural healthcare access. This was pure media amplification combined with direct institutional outreach.
This was a temporary and separate collaboration among news organizations in the Midwest focused on rural health access, which is often underserved by national media. Their primary impact goal was media amplification, and they achieved massive reach. One story was republished in 126 unique outlets across 32 states and in 18 national outlets. This massive reach meant their reporting transcended regional echo chambers.
And then they leveraged that amplification for institutional impact through direct outreach, which is a key strategic decision.
It is. INN, acting as the project manager, specifically distributed the findings and the content package directly to public officials, lawmakers, and policy think tanks. The outcome was clear. 3 presidential candidates referred to the content in speeches and shared it via social media networks during the election cycle. Direct, strategic outreach to politicians might seem taboo to traditional media, as one INM specialist noted, but the data proves the strategy was highly effective for generating public debate and influencing the national agenda.
This really highlights the critical role of a non-competitive third party like INN, facilitating the collaboration and managing the data.
That's perhaps the biggest lesson learned about internal bridge building. INN was a trusted, non-competitive manager, and they included an agreement to share data and analytics in the collaboration's Memorandum of Understanding. This successfully removed the hurdle of commercial news organizations being loath to share their proprietary audience numbers, reach, revenue metrics, which is a major historical barrier to collaboration. Speaking of commercial hurdles, let's look at this North Carolina News Collaborative, or NCNC, involving big commercial papers like Gannett and McClatchy sharing content on an ongoing basis. This is where the tension between collaboration and commercial instinct becomes clearest.
NCNC's goals are straightforward. Share content, reduce duplication in statewide reporting, and pursue ambitious projects with statewide impact. They are a crucial example of regional collaboration over competition, aiming for internal efficiency and wider impact.
But their biggest challenge wasn't philosophical, it was intensely technical and commercial.
It was. They had to overcome the technical issue of search engine optimization. When one paper republished a story from another, Google had to decide which was the original, and it often punished the smaller partner by de-ranking their content. They solved this by diligently using canonical URLs, which essentially signals to Google which version is the master copy. This was a necessary technical bridge to preserve the commercial viability of all partners. But what about impact measurement? The sources indicate they made a deliberate choice not to measure impact formally in the early stages. That seemed counterproductive to the entire goal of maximizing impact.
It is a fascinating compromise. They explicitly chose to make the process as frictionless as possible in the early stages, recognizing that egos and competition have gotten in the way historically. Impact measurement, particularly sharing proprietary metrics on reach and engagement, the data that drives their advertising revenue, was seen as a potential source of friction that could quickly derail the entire partnership.
So the necessity of collaboration was so high that they sacrificed the gold standard of impact measurement initially just to keep the organizational wedge standing. That seems like a dereliction of journalistic duty, failing to track the very change they aim to create.
It's a pragmatic dilemma, not necessarily a dereliction. They assumed the cross-publishing would result in greater impact, which it inherently did in terms of amplification, but they didn't measure it formally because the commercial instinct to protect proprietary audience numbers was just so strong. It highlights that building internal bridges within the media industry requires overcoming these historical competitive barriers before institutional metrics can be fully aligned. Sometimes success is simply maintaining the collaboration itself.
That complexity shows how fragile these bridges are, requiring constant negotiation between mission and commercial reality. But now let's turn to the final piece of the puzzle, the measurable proof that these civil conversations can actually depolarize people in the digital domain.
While media organizations are building these collaborative structures, researchers have been running rigorous experiments to test if digital conversations themselves can be designed to break polarization. This is where the field experiment conducted using a custom anonymous mobile chat platform called Discuss It provides critical evidence.
This was a brilliantly designed study because they controlled for variables that are usually so messy on platforms like Twitter or Facebook. They created an anonymous, asynchronous chat platform, paired Democrats and Republicans, and had them discuss contentious issues like gun control and immigration, all while tracking their polarization levels before and after.
Yes. They carefully designed the platform to mimic contemporary social media text-based, asynchronous, gender-neutral pseudonyms, but with one crucial difference. They randomized the pairings and conditions. And crucially, they designed the interaction to be dyadic one-on-one, which reduces the performative outrage that often characterizes group chats or public feeds.
And what was the core finding? Did these anonymous cross-party conversations just turn into flame wars, as many would predict?
Not at all. The headline finding is robust. Participants who engaged in anonymous cross-party conversations exhibited a significant reduction in overall polarization. It was equivalent to a 0.22 standard deviation increase in their depolarization index compared to the placebo group that just wrote an essay on the same topic. This is a rare, measurable, and successful example of an online intervention that reduced political tribalism.
That's huge. It suggests the internet isn't inherently polarizing, it's the design of the interaction that matters. So what conditions made this successful? They manipulated identity cues, whether participants knew they were talking to an opposing partisan or not. This is where the psychology gets really twisty.
This is perhaps the most counterintuitive finding of the whole thing. The participants were randomized into 3 labeling conditions regarding their chat partner's party identification. Correctly labeled, so told they were talking to an opposite partisan; mislabeled, told they were talking to a co-partisan; or unlabeled, no party ID given.
I would assume that the correctly labeled condition, knowing you were interacting civilly with the enemy, would produce the strongest depolarization effect, because it's a direct shock to your stereotype of the other side.
You're half right. Participants who were correctly labeled did show high depolarization. But here's the twist that redefines platform design strategy. Participants who were mislabeled told they were talking to a co-partisan, but were actually talking to their political opposite, also showed high depolarization, statistically comparable to the correctly labeled group.
Wait, they depolarized just as much, even though they thought they were talking to someone on their own team. That means the civil conversation still challenged their existing beliefs, but why did they depolarize if they thought they were interacting with someone they already agreed with?
It's a self-correction mechanism. See, polarization is fueled by wildly exaggerated, often negative stereotypes about what the other side believes. But it's also fueled by exaggerated assumptions about the purity and unified extremism of one's own side. When the participant believed they were talking to a co-partisan, and that person articulated a view that was civil, nuanced, or slightly more moderate than expected, it challenged the perception of the in-group. They might think, if someone on my team is being this reasonable, maybe my original hardline position wasn't the only legitimate view. The civil interaction still forces them to confront complexity, whether the identity cue is true or false.
That is brilliant. The lie about the identity label still forced them to engage with the stereotype. And the crucial evidence supporting this interpretation comes from the third condition.
Exactly. The most significant finding is the control. The unlabeled condition, where no party ID was given. This group showed the smallest, non-significant depolarization effect.
So what does this all mean for bridge building? The mere act of having a cross-party conversation wasn't enough. The participants had to connect the experience back to their partisan identity, even if they were lied to about their partner's identity, for the attitude change to occur.
That's the interpretation. The connection to existing partisan stereotypes, whether confirmed or contradicted, is necessary for attitude change. When people know they are talking to a partisan correctly or incorrectly labeled, they engage those stereotypes. The civil interaction by a peer then successfully contradicts those exaggerated stereotypes. Without the partisan label, the conversation is just a polite chat with a stranger. It doesn't challenge the fundamental us versus them framework that drives the mega-identity.
That is a phenomenal strategic insight for platform design. You need to acknowledge the partisan context, not ignore it, to achieve meaningful change. But the research also uncovered a sticky problem: the asymmetric effect.
The research found a notable asymmetric effect when looking at the parties separately. Political polarization research often finds these asymmetries, and this experiment confirmed it.
Oh, this suggests the intervention itself is not symmetrical.
It is not. Republicans showed a statistically significant depolarization effect, a substantial 0.38 standard deviations, while Democrats did not. showing a much smaller and non-significant effect of 0.09 standard deviations.
Wait, if we are building bridges, shouldn't they be bidirectional? What does it say about the success of the study design if it only works significantly on one side? Doesn't that suggest a failing of the intervention itself?
That is the necessary critical question. And it doesn't necessarily mean the intervention failed, but rather that it reflects the reality of how polarization has evolved. Other research suggests that over the past few decades, polarization has been driven asymmetrically, with the Republican Party becoming structurally more ideologically uniform and extreme, partly due to the influence of conservative media and elite rhetoric.
So if one side has a more rigid, unified mega-identity that is constantly reinforced by partisan media, it stands to reason that when a peer from that side is exposed to nuance, the shock to the system, the depolarization effect, is much greater.
That is exactly the theoretical interpretation. The depolarization seems to be driven primarily by the exposure of conservative peers to views and stereotypes distinct from the echo chambers of elite rhetoric and partisan media. Regular people, speaking civilly, simply don't conform to the highly exaggerated negative stereotypes that elite partisan media often paints of the other side. Because the conservative media ecosystem tends to be more unified than the liberal one, the exposure to diverse views via a peer produces a larger psychological shock among Republicans. For Democrats, the exposure may be less shocking because the liberal media ecosystem already has more internal diversity and less rigidity.
It re-emphasizes that bridging strategies have to acknowledge the non-symmetrical nature of the problem they're trying to solve. Finally, what about the mechanism of the conversation itself? We talk about civility being crucial in mediator techniques. Was that also measurable online?
Yes. The data confirmed that depolarization was significantly correlated with the civility of the chat partner's language. And crucially, the tone set in the first few exchanges mattered greatly. Participants were far more likely to experience depolarization if the interaction started with civil, respectful language. If the temperature rose quickly, the conversation reverted to defense mechanisms and attitude change rarely occurred.
So even in an anonymous one-on-one environment, the basic psychological need for civility dictates whether someone will open their mind to complexity. The principles of looping, complicating the narrative, and civil exchange apply across all platforms.
Precisely. It brings us back full circle to the psychological strategies developed by mediators. Whether you're a journalist covering a local feud or a Republican talking anonymously to a Democrat on an app, sustained civility is the foundational key to unlocking trust and allowing people to consider new ideas.
So this deep dive has shown that the high walls of our information castles, while real and driven by the formation of this psychological mega-identity, are not insurmountable. We've seen that the sorting that leads to this identity fusion is driven not by the frequency of news consumption, but by the absence of diverse, centrist, or cross-cutting sources in one's media diet. And that's a clear directive for policymakers and media organizations to support and amplify centrist bridge outlets.
And we've seen that structurally, media organizations can act as strategic bridge builders through collaboration. They can achieve massive institutional or policy impact like the $1.2 billion recovered by ICIJ when they move beyond commercial competition and use neutral entities to coordinate efforts and measure change, even when that collaboration is initially fragile, as we saw with the NCNC having to prioritize frictionlessness over formal metrics.
We've also gained these valuable psychological tools from mediators. The power of complicating the narrative by amplifying contradictions, widening the lens from episodic to thematic framing, seeking motivations over positions, and that essential, magical practice of looping for understanding, which creates cognitive ease and trust.
And finally, the digital space, which is so often blamed for polarization, holds immense potential. Rigorously designed platforms for anonymous, one-on-one, peer-to-peer conversations, like the Discuss It experiment, have been proven to reduce polarization. However, they have to be designed strategically. They need to engage partisan identity cues to force that confrontation with stereotypes, and they must prioritize civil interaction, particularly at the very start of the conversation.
So what does this all synthesize into? We've seen that the work is highly detailed, highly strategic, and requires intention at every single level, from the micro level of conversational technique to the macro level of organizational structure.
The erosion of political tribalism begins the moment we are given an opportunity to encounter a fellow citizen as a complicated human, not a simplified enemy. The most powerful bridges across the ideological divide are not built by massive organizations or loud pronouncements. They are built by the smallest, most intentional acts. A journalist choosing to amplify contradiction within an interviewee's stance, a news editor choosing collaboration over competition and overcoming the lure of proprietary data, or a person online choosing sustained civility when they know they are talking to their political opposite. These small acts, when replicated strategically, offer a genuine pathway to temper the mega-identity and mitigate polarization.